I am employed during the night shift as a security officer at a recycling yard. For confidentiality purposes, I am unable to reveal the company's name. I have been assigned to this location for a fortnight, currently in the midst of my second week. Throughout my shift, my duties include conducting regular patrols across an expansive recycling yard that houses valuable metals, which are processed and sold. My primary responsibility involves scanning various checkpoints to ensure the absence of unauthorized individuals in the yard or premises. An additional task on my list entails navigating through a grassy and densely vegetated area, as well as crossing a set of train tracks to capture an image of a distant warehouse. This procedure is performed to guarantee the safety and clearance of the area. I rely on a potent flashlight boasting 2K lumens to light my path, granting me clear visibility across the entire yard. Around 90 minutes ago, during one of my rounds, I followed my routine of moving through the grass and crossing the train tracks to capture the customary warehouse photograph. After taking the picture and submitting it, an intense sensation swept over me, akin to being surveilled closely. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end, and I found myself immobilized. My flashlight remained active, its beam directed toward the warehouse. Gradually, I pivoted, aiming the light's beam behind me. To my astonishment, at a distance of approximately 10 yards, I discerned a slender, elderly gentleman seated on a chair. His gaze was fixated squarely on me. He was clad in soiled denim overalls and sported what appeared to be a Western-style cowboy fedora atop his long white beard. His exposed skin was visible beneath the overalls. Now I'm a 6-foot-tall, 220-pound individual, yet I must admit that I emitted a cry reminiscent of a startled child, an embarrassingly authentic reaction. Startled, I dropped my flashlight, causing thin, sharp metal fragments to scatter on the ground. The sudden fright left me momentarily blinded. In the midst of the darkness, the only audible sounds were rapid footsteps accompanied by the clinking of metal. The sounds drew nearer at a swift pace, narrowing the gap to about 5 feet. Subsequently, within a matter of seconds, the footsteps abruptly veered to my left and raced past me. As the metal clinking faded into the distance, the rustling of bushes followed suit. Gathering my composure, I retrieved my fallen flashlight and directed its beam toward the source of the noise. However, the elderly man had vanished, disappearing behind the shrubbery into an unfamiliar location. Shivering from a mixture of adrenaline and fear, I managed to regain control of my breath and swiftly reached out to emergency personnel. Unfortunately, by the time they arrived, the elderly man had already departed. I speculate that he may have been observing passing trains, as his metal chair was positioned towards the tracks. The chair remains in its place, and I have taken a photograph as a personal memento. Regrettably, I cannot share it within this forum, as photo uploads are not supported. At present, I find myself in the office, still gripped by terror and isolation. I have the remainder of my shift to complete tonight, followed by another draining 11-hour night shift tomorrow. Despite my lingering unease, quitting is not a viable option, as I am in dire need of the income. I merely needed to unload this disquieting encounter from my thoughts and convey it to others. In the 1990s, I lived in a quaint college town in Pennsylvania alongside my mother and brother. Our modest dwelling was a single-story house positioned at the corner next to the up. Regrettably, my mother lacked the responsibility required of a parent, frequently leaving my brother and me home alone when we were quite young. On a particular day, she set out to walk to the nearby grocery store, a leisurely 10 to 15-minute stroll away. While she initially invited me to join, I chose to stay behind for reasons that have slipped from my memory. But shortly after she departed, I had a change of heart. Glancing through the window, I spotted her at the crossroads, accompanied by my younger brother. In a state of panic, I hurriedly dashed towards them, calling out, "I want to go, I want to go." Her response was to suggest I grab a jacket. Rushing back home, I retrieved the jacket and returned to the intersection, only to find my mother gone. Presumably, her patience had worn thin, leading her to leave. In my peripheral vision, I noticed a man, possibly in his early 20s, donned in a black trench coat with spiked hair. He wore rollerblades and started moving closer. As a child overly inclined to caution, paranoia gripped me, prompting me to sprint as swiftly as my legs could manage. Unbeknownst to me, the sound of his rollerblades reverberated behind me, indicating his rapid pursuit. Upon reaching home, I swiftly entered and secured the door. With a metal pipe I had found in the bathroom, I sought shelter beneath my bed. A symphony of knocks and eventually forceful pounding echoed at my front door, sending shivers down my spine. Fear consumed me as I grappled with the notion that this could be the end. Nonetheless, amid the terror, I made a resolution to defend myself if my life was truly at stake. I committed to striking him with all my might, prepared to confront the intruder head-on. Slowly, the knocking subsided, though my heart continued its rapid pace. Time seemed to stretch indefinitely as I waited in excruciating silence. Summoning my courage, I cautiously emerged from under the bed, only to be met by his chilling gaze through the window. Overwhelmed by fear, I let out a scream and swiftly retreated back under the bed, anxiously awaiting my mother's return. When she finally came back, I recounted the harrowing experience in vivid detail. Unfortunately, she dismissed my narrative, refusing to believe my words. This disbelief has haunted me ever since. I've often pondered about the intentions of the enigmatic man, and what fate might have awaited me had he managed to catch me. During my adolescent years, roughly at the age of 13, I used to provide babysitting services for a neighbour with whom I shared a close connection. Despite my young age, I was considered mature and had a prior friendship with her children before they relocated to live with their father, who resided a couple of hours away. To maintain privacy, we'll refer to my neighbour as C and her son, who is on the autism spectrum, as J. On a Friday evening, I found myself without any plans, and C inquired if I could look after J while she went out to meet a male friend she had known for a few years. Before delving into the subsequent events, it's crucial to understand some context about C. She had a broad network of acquaintances, not all of whom had the best reputations. The local kids were aware of this, as we had spent our childhood and early teenage years assisting in the care of her children and helping out whenever needed. C held connections and a notable social standing within our community, spanning from neighbours just minutes away to others situated hours distant. Therefore, when C approached me on that particular Friday night inquiring about an unfamiliar man's name, it didn't come as a surprise. Given C's circumstances, as a single mother juggling 3 jobs while taking care of 2 children and a toddler, I recognized that her material possessions, like her house, car, and clothing, were not extravagant. Around 10 p.m., after spending a relatively uneventful 4 hours with Jay, I got him ready for bed by changing him into his pajamas and settling him down. Knowing his fondness for the movie Cars during that period, I played it for him, and he drifted off to sleep quickly, leaving me alone in the living room. Curiosity about C's whereabouts prompted me to call her to check if she was on her way home. During the call, she mentioned she was leaving a bar. It was evident that she was quite inebriated, and I hoped that the gentleman she was with would drive her the short distance back home. Roughly 7 minutes later, I noticed a sleek 2017 BMW 3 Series pulling into the driveway, which caught me off guard and aroused my suspicions. I peered out the window to see if C was in the passenger seat. Given C's lack of opulent possessions, this struck me as peculiar. I observed her stumbling out of the car, accompanied by the man who escorted her into the house. I greeted him, but he declined to provide his name. Instead, he smiled and expressed gratitude for my care of Jay, allowing him to spend time with C. I reassured him that it wasn't a problem and wished them an enjoyable evening. Fast-forwarding by 10 minutes, C inquired about Jay's whereabouts. I informed her that it was late, so I had put him to bed and recommended that she change into more comfortable attire. However, she ended up lying down in her bed, still fully clothed, and promptly fell asleep. This left me, a young teenager, alone with a man in his 40s who had thinning hair. We sat on the kitchen floor and engaged in an unexpected deep conversation. At one point, he asked me to tap on his ribs out of curiosity. To my astonishment, I heard a distinctive metallic sound, as if his ribs were made of metal. Surprised, I questioned him about it and what had caused this. He let out a sigh, leaned back, and slightly lifted his shirt, revealing a skin graft on his abdomen with a notably different skin tone and stitches encircling it. I observed scars on his stomach and chest, some resembling bullet wounds, which led me to inquire further. He closed his eyes and commenced narrating a story. According to him, his ex-girlfriend had intentionally run him over with a car, not just once but 13 times, 2 years prior. My jaw dropped as I contemplated the myriad reasons why someone would subject another person to such a harrowing experience. My thoughts raced, and I couldn't help but ponder if I was in some sort of danger. These were the natural questions that would arise in such a situation. And so, the story unfolded. He recanted that he had proposed to his girlfriend the week before, and she had arranged a family barbecue to announce it. Upon arriving and seeing her cooking, he noticed the barbecue being prepared with doubt, since she had never attempted it before. When he took a bite, he realized it was overly dry, causing him to cough discreetly. When she inquired if he liked it, he reluctantly answered affirmatively to avoid an argument. However, his coughing persisted, and when she questioned him about it, he confessed that it was slightly dry. This triggered a disagreement, and he opted to head to his car. Regrettably, she got to the car before him and intentionally struck him with her vehicle while reversing, driving over his ribs 13 times. It was incredible that he survived such a traumatic event. I was in shock, struggling to comprehend how someone could endure such a horrifying ordeal. Numerous questions flooded my mind. Was this older man jesting? Was his story genuine? Who was he really? Summoning the courage, I asked him, "But who are you? What's your name?" He gazed at me, his eyes shifting, and replied with a grave seriousness, "Which name?" "The one I was given at birth." He chuckled briefly, but the mirth quickly faded, revealing that he had numerous aliases and couldn't disclose any one of them. He asserted that he was sought after in 12 countries and various regions along the West Coast. Anxiety washed over me, causing me to break into a sweat. I had no idea whether he was being sincere or if it was all a fabrication. Then he retrieved his wallet, revealing at least 10 identification cards. The reality hit me. This was legitimate. He locked eyes with me and uttered, "If you or C ever find yourselves needing someone removed, disappeared from your lives in an instant." He emphasized this with a snap of his fingers. "Tell C to get in touch, and I can make it happen." With that, he stood up, opened the door, got into his luxurious car, and vanished from sight. This entire incident would have been unsettling on its own if it had concluded there. Perhaps he was merely teasing, playing a prank on me. However, the situation took a darker turn. The following morning, I approached C and asked her about the identity of the man she had returned home with. Baffled, she responded, "What man?" I described his car, his rib injury, and his bald head, but she had no clue what I was referring to. To this day, I remain ignorant about the true identity of that individual, his actual name, his origins, and whether he was dishonest or even real. A year ago, I found myself immersed in a local app that facilitated connections with people in my vicinity. It was during this time that I encountered a delightful young woman who shared my interests. Our connection was immediate, leading to the exchange of contact details and photos. The situation felt idyllic, almost unnaturally so. She showered me with compliments, particularly praising my courteous demeanor, for the female readers. This attention was novel for me, even if she didn't conform to conventional beauty standards. Her presence stirred something within me. Over time, we decided to meet on a Saturday afternoon, spending enjoyable moments together. Our interaction extended to visiting her place, where we continued to have a splendid time. Although I contemplated staying overnight, she declined the offer. This left me pondering whether my actions had dissuaded her interest, but I refrained from dwelling on it. I carried on with my day and left her residence. Surprisingly, her interest remained unabated. Merely half an hour after I returned home, she messaged to ensure my safe arrival. Our conversation flowed towards life and various subjects, though no significant developments arose until a fortnight later. Upon completing my studies, the desire to meet her once again grew strong. However, a subtle shift was palpable. Her messages were devoid of emojis and displayed greater directness, a departure from her usual style. Despite these nuances, my yearnings clouded my judgment, preventing me from scrutinizing the change. It was as if someone else inhabited her communication, yet my focus remained unwavering. I suggested picking her up at her residence, yet she insisted on rendezvousing at a nearby park due to her need for fuel. Strangely, the appointed time was when twilight transitioned into darkness, a detail that struck me as odd. Nevertheless, this detail didn't raise concern at that moment. Upon inquiring about our park meeting, her response carried a sharp edge, urging me not to pose foolish questions and simply be punctual. I replied with a nonchalant, "Lol, okay." Upon reaching the park and waiting for her, she arrived 10 minutes later. I brushed off the delay, simply relieved to reunite. As she parked her car, an inexplicable unease washed over me. An unsettling sensation hinted that something was amiss, though I couldn't pinpoint the source. Glancing around, I assessed the surroundings, even checking the bushes to rule out any lurking figures. She lingered inside her car for 2 to 3 minutes, a behavior reminiscent of a previous unfunny prank. With tinted windows obstructing visibility, I stood about 20 to 30 meters away, anticipating her exit. However, she remained inside. My grin, perhaps stemming from nervousness, was aimed at her car, assuming she was playing another unamusing joke. Unexpectedly, my phone rang. Simultaneously, the sound of multiple car doors opening reached my ears. Her vehicle was positioned horizontally, obscuring my view of potential additional occupants. In an instant, my instinctual response toggled between fight and flight. Intuition screamed that something was awry. Without casting a backward glance to identify the emerging figures, I propelled myself into a frantic escape. After successfully evading the situation, I swiftly erased her contact details and blocked her. Even now, I speculate that she'd have been unfaithful to her boyfriend, who had uncovered her actions and harbored aggressive intentions towards me. News abounds with instances of violent reactions provoked by infidelity, a fate I was determined to avoid. I even entertained the notion that she wasn't alone in the car. It's plausible that malevolent accomplices were involved. The adrenaline surge propelled me in a sprint, a surprising response to the peril. The sensation defies description. Just 3 weeks ago, an incident unfolded that has occupied my thoughts ever since. In this recent occurrence, I am deeply convinced that both my patient and I narrowly evaded a dangerous situation. My professional role involves aiding individuals grappling with substance abuse disorders, mental health challenges, and to a lesser extent, mild developmental delays. Specifically, in regard to those with developmental delays, my responsibilities parallel those of a social worker with a lower rank. Among the tasks I undertake is ensuring that participants can attain their personal yearly objectives, much like an individualized education program, IEP, in the context of public schools. One specific patient had set a goal to engage in walking or hiking for at least 1 mile, 3 times a week. During a home visit, witnessing her achieve this objective held great significance. Consequently, She led both of us along a nearby walking and light hiking trail. Sharing a similar age of 40, we strolled and conversed as we traversed the path. Gradually, we found ourselves at a more secluded spot, having moved away from the path encircling a neighborhood pond, a frequented location. Instead, we found ourselves on a trail guiding us through woods and a cotton field. As we continued our journey, my patient abruptly halted her steps. Meeting her gaze, I sensed her discomfort just as she was about to vocalize it. In that moment, an intense feeling washed over me, the distinct sensation of being observed. Given our developmental delays, my concern for her well-being seemed to surpass my own. It's challenging to articulate, but rather than fear, a profound sense of protectiveness enveloped me. I instinctively looked back upon hearing rustling leaves. To my surprise, a man in his 30s emerged from the woods, slowly advancing in our direction. Considering our isolated surroundings and his unexpected appearance, I discerned his intentions were far from benign. With the priority of ensuring my patient's safety, I encouraged her to keep walking, allowing her to gain some distance. Without a clear explanation, I pivoted around entirely, arresting my own progress, and directed an unwavering gaze directly at him. Our eyes locked, and in that instance, it felt as if he comprehended our awareness of his presence. He froze, his advance coming to an abrupt halt. Holding my gaze resolutely, I began retracing my steps towards my patient, underscoring my focus on him. Moving backward, I noticed my patient briefly glance back at him, only to find he had vanished into the woods as suddenly as he had emerged. If his intention was solely innocent, a mere stroll along the nature trail, why did he cease his movement upon my direct confrontation? Why didn't he simply continue walking past us? The reality dawned on me that this individual had been lurking and observing, anticipating the arrival of a woman or women onto that isolated trail. His emergence from the woods at precisely that moment underscored his concealed and predatory behavior. I remained steadfast in my belief that the combined intuition of my patient and my own perception of being watched spared us from whatever harm he had intended to inflict. From time to time, a memory resurfaces, bringing to mind the invaluable lesson our parents instilled in us about the risks associated with placing trust in unfamiliar individuals. I am particularly appreciative of my sister for heeding that counsel. Permit me to share an episode from the 1990s when my two siblings and I were en route from home to our school bus stop. Just for context, I was 7 years old, my brother was 8, and my sister was almost 11. On that misty morning, the surroundings were oddly quiet as we walked towards the bus stop, with no one else in sight. A small white sedan gradually approached us, keeping pace with us. We felt a mixture of curiosity and bewilderment as we gazed at the vehicle. Seated in the driver's seat was a white woman with long, curly brown hair, her gaze fixed intently on us. Judging by her appearance, she seemed to be in her mid-30s to early 40s. This strange encounter persisted for a few moments before she rolled down her window and casually inquired, "Hey kids, are you on your way to school?" Our unsettling smile, combined with her piercing gaze, made us nod, our backpacks making our purpose evident. She gestured invitingly and suggested, "Why don't you three hop in? I can give you a lift to school." As a lazy 7-year-old, the idea of a free ride excited me, and I eagerly responded, "Sure." However, my sister, clutching my arm firmly, responded with resolve, "No, thank you." The woman's smile momentarily faded before swiftly reappearing. "Oh, it's all right. You don't need to walk. I can get you there quickly," she insisted, trying to sound kind. A shiver ran down my spine, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. My sister's tone grew even more resolute as she repeated, "No." My brother appeared frightened, while I stood there, perplexed and alarmed by his expression. In that instant, the woman turned the steering wheel, edging the car closer to the curb, almost reaching us. Fear gripped us, causing us to freeze in our tracks. "Get in the car," she commanded, coming to a halt. Her smile vanished, replaced by a sinister sneer, and as she drew nearer, I could discern her eyes, dark voids exuding malevolence, glaring at us. That was the tipping point. My sister swiftly lifted me and yelled at my brother to run. Incredibly, she summoned strength akin to the Hulk, and together they sprinted down the sidewalk as fast as they could. Clutching onto my sister, I screamed, narrowly avoiding stumbling twice along the way. Fortunately, the car did not give chase. Instead, it accelerated and turned onto another street. We didn't cease running until we reached the safety of our home. We sobbed, locking the door and awaiting our working parents' return. In those days, we only had landlines, and pagers were reserved for adults. Upon reflection, were it not for my sister's quick thinking, I might have become a victim of abduction, facing unthinkable consequences. This incident serves as a stark reminder of the importance of educating children never to place trust in strangers, a crucial lesson that, unfortunately, I overlooked. Several years ago, during my early days of motherhood, I found myself at home with my newborn baby. The time had come for an oil change and tire rotation for my car. Instead of enduring hours in the dealership waiting room, I saw a chance to explore a nearby arboretum while the tasks were underway. Despite having visited the arboretum before, this particular visit captured my attention due to a sign marking a trail named Patriot's Path. This paved pathway stretched across the county for 35 miles, but was divided into segments due to roads and neighborhoods. Having previously ventured along parts of the trail without any concerns, I saw this as an excellent way to spend time. So, with my baby comfortably in a stroller, I enthusiastically set out to explore this new trail segment. At first, the path led through tall grasses before gradually transitioning into a more wooded area. This change didn't bother me much, given that I had walked predominantly wooded sections of the trail in the past. While enjoying the serene environment and pushing my baby in the stroller, I encountered a fork in the trail. Previous sections had always been a single, uninterrupted path. However, this time, I had to choose between two routes. Opting for the higher route, I continued along the right path. It soon became apparent that the stroller was struggling on the increasingly challenging terrain. Tree roots had disrupted the path, making the ride rough for my baby. Unable to keep up my usual pace, I decided to consult my map app to check if this section was part of the trail and where it would lead. According to the map, the left side of the fork followed a waterway. Armed with this information, I made the choice to take that direction. Just as I was turning around, I noticed a well-dressed man approaching at a leisurely pace, his phone held up to his face as if on a call, though he wasn't speaking. As we neared each other, I expected the usual friendly nod, but he kept his gaze fixed ahead, devoid of expression. This strange interaction triggered a sense of unease within me. His attire appeared more businesslike, unlike the typical exercise attire of other trailgoers. Moreover, he wasn't conversing on the phone he held to his ear, and his other hand remained hidden behind his back, hinting at secrecy. Despite my growing unease, I reassured myself it was just my imagination and proceeded along the other fork of the trail. After walking for some time, I anticipated reaching the waterway and a path leading to a parking area, as indicated by my map app. To my surprise, however, there were no signs of the waterway, and upon trying to use my phone, I discovered it was no longer functioning. Now deep within the woods, accompanied only by my baby and devoid of communication, I realized it was time to turn back. Unfortunately, my heart sank when I once again came across the man. His expression remained unchanged, phone pressed to his ear in silence, and his concealed hand remained behind his back. Panic surged through me as questions raced through my mind. Why did he turn back on the path? Why did he choose the same fork as us? It became apparent that he must have noticed our turn and followed suit. Every instinct within me screamed to escape from that situation. As we approached him, I began to jog, hoping to convey the image of a simple jogger on the trail. I continued jogging until we reached the tall grass, only allowing myself to glance back then. Fortunately, my son and I were once again alone. I kept jogging until a significant distance separated us from the trail. Eventually, we waited in the dealership waiting room for the remainder of the car service time. While I did return to the Arboretum afterward, I never ventured down that particular section of the trail again. Maybe the man I encountered was simply a regular businessman, and there was no ill intention. However, personally, I'd rather trust my instincts, go for an unplanned jog, and avoid disregarding my gut feelings, which could lead to consequences later on. I'm a 17-year-old young woman who recently left my position at a fast food establishment. I had been employed there for nearly 10 months, but various factors compelled me to contemplate staying no longer. My regular work hours spanned from 5 p.m. to 11 p.m. on weekends, during which I frequently served familiar customers. I had even committed most of their orders to memory, efficiently attending to their needs once I recognized their voices. Majority of these patrons were courteous and occasionally left tips. Nevertheless, a disconcerting incident occurred one day. On a particularly bustling day amidst the usual rush, I noticed an unfamiliar gentleman who appeared cautious and uneasy. It was early in my shift, and I was engrossed in handling orders at the drive-through window. When our eyes met, I instantly felt a sense of unease. Nonetheless, I brushed aside this feeling and carried on with my tasks. After my manager organized my cash drawer, I took charge of the drive-through responsibilities, managing orders, payments, and other duties. Due to the high influx of orders, I wasn't paying close attention to specific voices or menu selections. Yet, a certain voice caught my ear, a low, uncertain tone placing an order for a sandwich. I provided the total, and the man waited in line. Upon reaching the window, I realized it was the same individual from earlier. I assumed he had forgotten to place his order previously. As his vehicle was lower to the ground, he had to extend his arm to hand over his debit card. During this exchange, he murmured something under his breath, maintaining unbroken eye contact. This made me uneasy, prompting me to ask, "Pardon me, what did you say?" He replied, "You look beautiful today." At this point, my discomfort grew. Not only did I have a boyfriend, but I was also underage and uninterested. Nervously, I responded, "Thank you." I handed him his food bag and swiftly closed the window as he drove off. I casually shared my encounter with the man with some male colleagues, as we often did when faced with peculiar customers. However, I couldn't shake off the lingering strange feeling. Later, when the queue time was approximately 10 minutes, I heard a familiar yet agitated and forceful voice through the microphone, requesting a cup of water. I caught a glimpse of his face through his windshield and stepped away from the window, allowing my manager to handle him. This pattern repeated a few more times throughout the day. He would ask for straws and other complimentary items, and it became apparent that he was merely trying to catch sight of me. His presence began to frustrate me to the point where I eventually sought refuge in the bathroom to shed tears. Normally, I had a strong disposition in such situations, but my patience had worn thin. The remainder of the evening progressed without further interactions with him. I believed I would never have to encounter him again until my final shift at the establishment, a few months later. It was a tranquil evening, much later in the day compared to our initial encounter. While I didn't recognize his voice, his face and car were immediately familiar. Suppressing my pride, I processed his payment, doing my best to avoid making eye contact. I informed my manager, who kindly offered to distribute his order on my behalf. As expected, the man returned to the drive-thru shortly after, asking for a cup of water. This time, I took a wiser approach. I asked a male coworker to handle his request, explaining that I was occupied. Once he received the water, the man inquired with my coworker, "Do you close at 11 now?" I felt a sense of relief knowing my mother would be picking me up that night. I continuously cast anxious glances out the windows, ensuring he wasn't lingering outside, waiting for me. You could label it as paranoia, but having consumed enough true crime stories, I had become exceptionally cautious. At the age of 12, an unsettling incident occurred that continues to unsettle me, even though it happened over half a lifetime ago. I often try to push it out of my mind, not dwelling on the potential consequences if it weren't for the help of two kind strangers. On that particular day after school, I started my 4-kilometer journey home along a busy road, walking by myself. While crossing intersections, I encountered a tall, disheveled man who seemed to take notice of me. Estimating his age was a challenge for me as a child, but I thought he might be in his early 30s. The man began following me and tried to strike up a conversation. He gave me compliments, insisting on being friends and asking about where I lived and whether my parents were home. He bombarded me with questions, but I tried to politely dismiss them. I didn't answer any of his questions and quickened my pace as we approached my neighborhood. An intense feeling of unease washed over me. I didn't want him to know where I lived. His strange demeanor and way of talking to me, a child, made me uncomfortable. To get away from him, I reluctantly decided to give him a fake cell phone number, agreeing to answer his calls. Feeling uneasy, I left the scene as quickly as possible. Several months went by without encountering the man, causing me to suppress the memory. I thought he was just an odd stranger. However, that didn't turn out to be the case. About 4 months later, on my way home from school again, lost in my thoughts and unaware of my surroundings, I suddenly heard hurried footsteps behind me. Instinctively, I turned around to see the same creepy man from before. He slowed down upon reaching me, but continued yelling angrily. He had discovered that I'd given him a fake number, and his anger was evident. He accused me of thinking I was better than him, and expressed his anger openly. In that moment, fear gripped me, worried that he might harm me. Despite my efforts, I couldn't get the attention of passing drivers. With him still following me and shouting non-stop, I speed-walked to the nearest gas station, thankfully not too far away. When I arrived, I immediately caught the eye of 2 strong-looking men next to their pickup truck. They looked concerned as they saw my frightened expression, and the man trailing behind me. They quickly approached, asking if I was okay. Too scared to talk, I shook my head vigorously and sought shelter behind them. The 2 men demanded an explanation from the man, who concocted a story about being my older brother. I remained quiet, shaking my head in disagreement. Recognizing the seriousness of the situation, the 2 men started berating the man, suspecting him of wrongdoing. Taking advantage of the distraction, I seized the opportunity to escape. The man noticed my attempt and chased after me, but the 2 men took offense to his actions. They promptly tackled him and forcefully placed him in the back of their pickup truck. He yelled as they sped away at a high speed, passing me and disappearing into the distance. I felt a sense of relief knowing they had taken him away, but I kept running until I reached the safety of my home. I couldn't fully grasp the entire ordeal, but it deeply shook me. I never found out where those 2 kind strangers took the creepy man or what happened to him. To be honest, I didn't want to know. I told my parents and changed my route home from school. Thankfully, I never saw him again, and I'm grateful for that. While I couldn't express myself at the time, those compassionate strangers understood my distress and handled the situation on my behalf. Even after all these years, I still vividly remember the sheer terror I felt, followed by immense relief when they removed him from my presence. Lately, a memory from the past came rushing back, urging me to seek my mother's confirmation to find some reassurance. Unfortunately, our response only served to confirm the truth of that memory. The trigger for this recollection was an incident that took place outside my workplace, where an individual innocently looked inside through a small window. This person didn't pose any danger, but their appearance unexpectedly brought back a distant memory from my early childhood when I lived in my first home. I was just 6 years old when we moved away from that house, shortly after a fence had been put up to make sure I was safe as I began to explore the world on my own. Despite this, my parents remained cautious about letting me roam outdoors freely until we eventually moved. Back then, I didn't fully understand their vigilance, but looking back, I now grasped their underlying worries. As it turns out, a few doors down from us lived a registered offender, a fact I learned after my mother confirmed my memory. His social worker had required him to inform his neighbours about his presence when he moved in. This individual had a habit of engaging in unsettling behaviour within the neighbourhood. On one occasion, he ran across the street, leaving a dent in our neighbour's garage door. He even entered another neighbour's house without permission, visibly distressed, and asked her to comfort him. She promptly kicked him out and informed the authorities after witnessing his inappropriate behaviour. Much of this disturbing information came to light during my own investigation, following my mother's confirmation. I stumbled upon his Facebook page, where a picture of him erased any doubts and vividly brought his image back to my mind. Even through the screen, seeing him made me feel instantly queasy. According to my recollection, I was sitting in our living room, engrossed in the TV, when I felt like I was being watched. In broad daylight, I turned toward the front windows, only to see a man with his face and hands pressed against the glass, a man who looked eerily similar to the one I saw on Facebook. His huge eyes and unsettlingly wide grin were aimed at me. I distinctly remember being quickly taken into another room, embraced by someone who, as my mother confirmed, must have been my grandmother looking after me at the time. Needless to say, I am incredibly relieved that we eventually moved away from that place.